Well, we'll continue with our analysis of last night's midterm elections with one of our experts and one of our friends. He's Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, now the president of Young America's Foundation. Thanks for joining us, Governor.
Thank you, Larry. Good to be with you.
Let's start in your home state of Wisconsin. First of all, as we mentioned, Ron Johnson just keeps chugging along. They did finally call the race for him, and he'll be coming back for his third term. A lot of people didn't expect that. Why do you think he continues to persevere?
Well, one, he runs in the right years, 2010, 2016, 2022. Even though it wasn't as big of a red wave as many people thought, it was a good year for the kind of things that we as conservatives talk about. Personal economic issues, public safety, parental involvement, education. Once he got focused on those issues, you know, Larry, you and I talked about it on your radio show earlier this year. I was worried about him, but I thought if he got back to those basics, and then the big issue was nailing down Mandela Barnes, lieutenant governor, who's not just got radical ideas, he is a radical. I think those were the two keys to his very close election.
Meanwhile, very close, that governor's race is still confusing me and boggling my mind because there were various calls. What ended up happening there with the governor's race in Wisconsin?
Yeah, it's unusual. It's the first time in 32 years that a person whose party was in the White House has won the governorship. Typically it goes back and forth, very much like Virginia has done traditionally over the years. And I think simply put, it was money. Tony Evers, the incumbent governor, was spending about almost 2.5 times as much as Tim Michels, and they just buried him in a tax. And you know, even before Biden, Tony Evers kind of perfected the basement strategy. He doesn't go out much. He doesn't draw attention to himself. And apparently that worked out.
Well, and this is going to be a continuing pattern of the conversation, doing a postmortem of yesterday, where I think you're going to see a lot of these candidates, many of them who came out of nowhere, backed by President Trump, like Mr. Michels in Wisconsin, like Dr. Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, like Blake Masters in Arizona, who did win the nomination on the strength of that endorsement. But then the money didn't show up, and there's already going to be some criticism that President Trump, who's sitting on quite a bit of campaign cash, didn't actually open up the purse strings himself.
Yeah, I think legitimately so. There was a big question about his power post the primary. Could he get past all of that? And for a lot of these folks, even Herschel Walker's right on the edge in Georgia. The other interesting story is in many of those states where there were Republican governors at the top of the ticket, they did more to carry the candidate than did the former president. You look at Georgia, certainly a big win for Brian Kemp, the governor there. That helped make it competitive in the U.S. Senate race. J.D. Vance, another one who could have slipped away in that election, but because of the massive win, not only with Governor DeWine, but all the other Republicans statewide in that ticket won big there. J.D. Vance did win, but just barely. And so in many ways, it was the big wins by Republican governors that carried the day in many of these battleground states.
You have won in one of these off-year elections. You rode into the governor's seat in 2010, and it was definitely an anti-incumbent sentiment and an anti-Democrat sentiment 2 years into the Obama administration. When you win a race like that, and clearly there were a lot of winners yesterday for the Republicans who won because Biden is very unpopular, how then do you turn that into an agenda exactly?
Well, you got to get out and act right away. The best advice I got back in 2009 when I was thinking about running and applied it 2 years later in 2011 when I actually was the governor was don't wait. Get out and move quickly. Keep reforming. Don't look back. Take your wins and apply it to the next series of reforms. What happens in the state houses is very similar to what happens in Washington, D.C. is people wait too long. And the longer you wait, the closer it is to the next election, and legislative bodies don't want to act on that. We, of course, acted right away. And, you know, there's some people who are don't like to shake things up, who say, well, I don't know, maybe that was too much. No, our reforms 12 years later are still intact because we took on big issues, big, bold ideas, and we enacted them early on in our time in office, and it paid off.
Governor Walker, it's hard to overlook the fact that incumbent Republican governors performed very strongly last night, especially certainly in Florida with Ron DeSantis and in Texas with Greg Abbott. You mentioned a little bit about how important and influential it is when you are the governor, but you know, in Nevada, we saw the Democrat incumbent go down in defeat. Why do you think Republican governors, especially in the post-COVID pandemic era, did so well and were so validated by their voters?
Well, I think it all goes back to freedom. When it comes to freedom in the economy, when it comes to freedom in education, I think there are a lot of folks, particularly blue-collar workers, who historically maybe leaned more Democrat in the past, or at least were more up in the air in play, have moved dramatically. We've seen it with blue-collar workers. We've seen it with Hispanic workers all across this country. And I think in many of these states, you see what Ron DeSantis did, what Greg Abbott did, what Kristi Noem did, what Chris Sununu did. A lot of these governors were much more aggressive than their counterparts in getting their states back open in the midst of COVID, not only with their economy, but keeping their kids in school, in-person education. It mattered dramatically. We saw that, of course, a year ago with the pushback from parents in Virginia, and I think you see across the country. Conversely, the incumbent governor in Nevada you referenced, I think it's a prime example. Nevada was a state that lives and dies based on tourism. They had that place locked down. And that woke up the eyes, opened the eyes, I should say, of many of those workers in Nevada versus a place like South Dakota, which lives and dies on tourism. And Kristi Noem was one of the earliest leaders of opening that state up. And I think that's a key difference between those races.
Governor Walker, I'd love for you to put on your Young America's Foundation hat for a moment now, because as the president of that great group, you're dealing with college kids all the time. You're dealing with high school kids all the time, and you're trying to spread the Reagan-esque conservative message to that new generation. Well, that new generation went heavy for Democrats based on exit polls that we're looking at. And I wonder if you could assess that for us. I mean, usually, what is it? Winston Churchill, I think, was the person who said if you're young and you're liberal, if you're young and you're not a liberal, you don't have a heart. And if you're old and you're not conservative, you don't have a brain. So we figure that young people are going to lean to the left. But it was a pretty significant margin for Democrats yesterday. Is this just pure bribery with the student loan payout? Is it the Dobbs decision? How do you analyze this?
I think it's more than all that. When all you hear is one thing, that's true in anything in life. You know, it's why our sports teams well liked within their area but not elsewhere. It's because that's all you hear growing up. Now, that's a good thing if you're a homer when it comes to sporting. But when all you hear on college campuses is radical indoctrination on a whole assortment of issues, it goes beyond just abortion, it goes beyond student loan debt, it goes to this whole sense of sex and race and gender. There's a real issue out there in America, and they're trying to pit one group versus another. We need to counter that. In many ways, this has become the canary in the coal mine, where it's not like they're going to grow up and graduate and suddenly get a job and start a family, and that'll all make the difference. No, the things that influence people, even in their teens today, will have a dramatic impact on how they vote and how they believe in things in the future. And so what we do at Young America's Foundation and many others like us across the country is more important today than it ever has been in the past.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is by the time you actually have an election cycle and a candidate is trying to reach those young voters, in many respects, the argument's already been made. What you need to do is reach them on campus with a Ben Shapiro speech or a Michael Knowles speech or a Matt Walsh speech. You need to actually reach them with these Young America's Foundation chapters on campus to sort of build it from the ground up, not just a politician coming out and trying to win votes on a month before the election.
Absolutely, and it's got to start even sooner than that. It's why we've already started moving in the middle school and younger ages, because the left is doing it. We've got to counter the radical indoctrination with positive conservative messages that can work if we cut through the maze.
Well, and to that end, just because I'm such a huge fan of Young America's Foundation at YAF.org, I love the fact that you're moving into the middle schools. We only got about 30 seconds, but can you let people know how they can be a part of that? Because that really is where the next several elections will be won.
Yeah, YF.org. Help us get middle school, high school, and college students. Come to the Reagan Ranch, come to our conferences. You can help us plug into that.
Governor Walker, not only are you an expert on being a governor and Republican politics and yesterday's midterms, you also know a thing or two about presidential politics. And today is day one of the 2024 presidential election. Can you stick with us for one more segment? And I want to get your analysis of how that's going to shape.
Sure.
Great, excellent. More to come with Governor Scott Walker on the 2024 presidential election, which begins today, next on O'Connor Tonight.